Yes, the title is super inflammatory, but hear me out. The medicalized, very constructed version of gender dysphoria is in fact not real. And people go way too mad at Abigail Philosophy Tube for deciding to make a point of saying that in a video. And I think I since I strongly agree with the point she was making, and I know exactly why she was making that point and where it's coming from, I'm going to, go through what is the point that she's making, where is it coming from, and why it's absolutely correct. So I'm in a closet because I think this would be a funny shot to have, and I have some notes that I have on an iPad to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting the point that Abigail was making, because, well, can't misrepresent people and not twitter.com. So, she starts off by talking about category errors, where you define a category by the individual bits of it rather than, you know, taking it as a category, with the example of the university being the collection of buildings rather than one single building, which, yes, fair enough. And then she goes on to be like, well, what if gender dysphoria is a category error? Spoilers, yes, I think it is. And I think it's a category error in the sense that you're labeling something incorrectly, which, well, she says as well, because she's based. The next point that she makes is that because it's a bunch of constituent parts that together form gender dysphoria and it's not one specific thing, those component parts can be analyzed. And if we analyze them, we can see that cis people also experience some of these. Think the feeling of wrongness that a woman going through menopause might feel. Trans people often feel that too. Or the emasculation that a cis man might feel while balding is something that a trans man might also feel, or a or a trans woman, or literally any other trans person. These are common feelings between cis and trans people. So Abigail then goes on to question, why is there a distinction between the feelings of gender discomfort that trans people feel and the feelings that cis people feel? Now, she goes on to point out, well, the idea that is a uniquely trans illness kind of comes from about 10 years ago at time of recording. If you're watching this like in 2024 or whatever, it'll be like 11 years ago. Anyway, bunch of cis doctors got together, including some now disgraced doctors, and they decided, okay, we need to stop labeling being trans itself as the mental illness and instead label something that only trans people have. Spoilers, it's not something only trans people have, as I mentioned before, and Abigail mentioned in the video that I'm referencing. It's going to be linked in the description. So, another thing that she mentioned is that it's like you get gatekept as a trans person for gender affirming care when cis people do not get gatekept for gender affirming care. And the fact that there's a diagnosis that only trans people need to get is a crock of shit. And she also goes to point out, which I think is pretty reasonable to point out because people might misinterpret you, and even though she did literally say this, people still took it to mean that she isn't saying this, but she straight up said gender dysphoria as a label, as a shorthand in lay speak to describe feelings of gender wrongness that a trans person might feel, is totally fine and is clearly a real thing because, well, the shorthand is a useful term. Is it useful as a medical diagnosis, though, is a whole nother question, and exactly the question that Abigail was dealing with, which people on Twitter did not like because she is a successful trans woman, and we can't have any of those, can we? ContraPoints. So, to wrap it up, She basically goes like, "Oh yeah, trans people need the mad T slur disease." I'm not gonna say it, I don't want to get demonetized and I don't want to bleep, but I think it's a really funny word. And cis people don't need it to be treated appropriately. And honestly, that is pretty close to the argument that I'd make if I wanted to talk about questioning why gender dysphoria as a diagnosis exists. So, good job, Abigail, an academically educated person making the same kind of argument that another academically educated person would make. Mind blown. However, not everyone's an academic. So I think it would be useful to uh, be a little good faith towards people that misinterpreted the argument about gender dysphoria and break it down into more simple terms for the people that were not willfully ignorant and deliberately misrepresenting what Miss Philosophy Tube had said in her video. So, essentially, we have a couple moving parts. First part is that gender dysphoria is a catch-all that is made up of various types of gender-related discomfort. And those gender-related discomforts are said to be unique to trans people, but not all trans people feel discomfort, and not all cis people don't feel discomfort. As I mentioned before when I was being more academic, a cis woman going through menopause might feel like her body is doing things it shouldn't be doing and feel weird, and the care of receiving hormone replacement therapy might be could be considered a form of gender affirmation. That is, affirming her feelings of discomfort and saying, hey, we can try and mitigate the thing that's causing discomfort, which sounds kind of like what HRT does for trans people that want it, funnily enough. So why do trans people need a specific diagnosis of gender dysphoria for receiving affirmation for these feelings when cis people do not? So this isn't to say that using gender dysphoria as a catch-all for various different types of discomfort related to gender, instead of explaining what the discomfort is and saying, oh, feeling dysphoric. Not to say that that is wrong or unhelpful, that is a perfectly fine way to use the word, but to use it to gatekeep trans people from care that is given readily to trans people. No, trans people are not readily given care, are they? It's cis people that are. Let's run it back. So to say that we need a specific diagnosis for trans people to receive the same care that cis people receive without that diagnosis is gatekeeping, and needless gatekeeping at that. And again, the feelings underlying this diagnosis are not fake, they are real. There is an argument to be made that trans people have historically needed to fake things to be heard, but that isn't to say that some trans people don't feel a very stereotypical form of dysphoria. That isn't to say that some trans people feel some components that go under the dysphoria label. And yeah, hopefully that's a more understandable form of the argument, because I'm not really sure how much further you could simplify it beyond cis people feel things that could be considered gender dysphoria as well, but don't get gatekept. Therefore, gender dysphoria is a made-up diagnosis that is bad. Oh wait, yeah, that is a simplification. Well, that's what the argument is. Bam. Simplified. Should make a channel simplified sociology or oversimplified sociology or something. That might be fun, wouldn't it? But why am I making this video if I'm just going to summarize the argument? Well, glad you asked. In addition to summarizing it, I think I have a perspective coming from a more sociology angle rather than a philosophy angle that Philosophy Tube comes at, because, well, she didn't really talk about this as far as I watched the video and looked at tweets. Don't ever look at tweets, by the way. but I think I can contribute another perspective of like why might something like this have arisen, and questioning further and deeper like what underlies all this. Yes, I am using the same background again because it is funny, and also the irony of having a children's show when talking about something that is maybe considered basic in some fields and is not actually that basic to most people is funny to me. But let's get into it. Science. Let's start with questioning that. In case you've been living under a rock for the past, say, 300 to 400 years, science as a method and cultural product is an idea that is used within Western society that has its roots within the Enlightenment period and Western philosophy more broadly, and particularly the tradition of empiricism, that is, knowledge through observation, evidence through observation. Empiricism is part of the category of epistemologies. It is an epistemology. And the reason that I say an epistemology is because it is not the singular epistemology. What is an epistemology, you may ask? Well, system of knowledge. It's a system of knowledge. You could probably gather that from the context in which I was talking about it, but that's what it is. And for people that haven't been living under a rock, but have been solidly drenched in Western cultural hegemony, it may come as a bit of a shock to you. But what I said before about there being multiple epistemologies and it being a category of things is that there are epistemologies that are not the scientific method and empiricism. Does the scientific method usually result in a pretty useful and helpful result? Yeah, I mean, a decent amount of the time it does. But that doesn't mean that it's the only way to create and organize and validate knowledge. And it's, well, a social construct. That doesn't mean it's wrong, as I said, like, it tends to be pretty solid at predicting things when applied properly. But it's a social construct. So, having arisen from a particular sociocultural context, the scientific method is deeply intertwined with and linked to that context that it developed in and reflects the context and culture it developed in. Why do you think that there are studies that are seeking to develop a neurological reason, a scientific reason for gender differentiation? What ends are we serving with that? Why are we trying to be objective about a binary system and more strongly entrench particular roles upon that? And it's this context, this questioning of science and recognizing it as a cultural social construct. That's where Abigail's argumentation finds its solid ground in the idea that science is not infallible. Science is just one epistemology among many that seems to be pretty solid, but is not the only one that can generate usable, helpful knowledge. And if we accept that sex and gender themselves are also social products and they're part of a socially constructed body of knowledge, how can you argue that something that arises from a mismatch between these is in fact real and solid and not something completely arbitrary that, you know, is in fact a solid thing when the underlying components that are constructed into it are not in fact solid and real. I believe that Abigail also has a video about specifically how gender and sex are arbitrary constructs for differentiation. So I know that this is the angle that she's thinking on it and coming at it from, right? But yeah, science, not infallible, not the only system of knowledge. Keep that one in mind. The next component of this discussion takes us to human rights. and why we have a framework of human rights. Um, in the writings of Diane Richardson, there is this concept of a framework for sexual citizenship and framing queerness within this framework of citizenship to a particular identity. And this is like largely a framework for public policy to have a frame of reference. Frame. There we go. I've got all the frames out of the system now. But there's this system of categorizing and saying these people want to get their rights because they want a citizenship of this identity. And it really fits into the small L liberal world order. Human rights go to groups based on who they are, and saying, ah, yes, I am born this way, therefore I earn citizenship. I am uh, getting sanguine citizenship to this identity and therefore deserve the rights befitting of this identity is appealing, is pragmatic even, to assert the fact that you are a human being that deserves rights. But what's pragmatic is not in fact always desirable. And using a strategy to gain rights, like you can use any strategy you want to try and get there, but stopping at the point of like, ah, yes, we are going to have a narrative that doesn't apply to everyone be the narrative that we go with to determine who does and doesn't belong to our group is both dangerous with the way that you can, completely, uh, let's say, get rid of that group if you figure out the particular trait that makes them that. And we see stuff like, well, various campaigns against groups. I'm not going to name a particular one, but if you know history, you know history. And so it's dangerous rhetoric. Um, the rest of Abigail's video that I'm jumping off of, though, is coming from horrible gatekeeping that arose from this concept, this way of getting rights by asserting citizenship, by asserting a born this way narrative, and resulting in people needing, I guess, needing the passport to be part of this country and being diagnosed with the mad T word disease because God, I wish I could say that like that word out loud in a video, but I'd probably get like a community guideline strike, even though I'm like talking about myself and reclaiming the term in the same way that, Abigail is. And I don't want to bleep it because I hate bleeps. Anyway, silly diversion aside, it's it's dangerous to both require this and then allow for a narrative that begets eugenics. I'm gonna say it, eugenics. That's what combining the scientific method with a born this way narrative results to. Now, it does born this way as a narrative does fit neatly into conception of rights, core affordances of citizenship, flattening a complex tapestry of human experience into those who fall into normal and those who fall outside normal, but it's okay that they fall outside the normal because they can't help it, guys, so just like pity them at least. But who does it serve to flatten experiences into this dichotomy of normal and abnormal? The answer should probably be quite self-evident. It's clearly those who gatekeep basic respect behind one's ability to jump through arbitrary hoops and prove that you deserve respect. Now, if I may be a little bit radical here, I think we should start with a baseline of respect for everyone, actually. We are all human beings, funnily enough. We have our differences. I'm not saying that everybody is the same and that I don't theorize, because that's stupid. But at the very least, we have that commonality. Despite our differences, we are human and begetting of respect. Now, even animals and the environment and stuff deserve respect. But when it comes to human rights, we're talking respecting humans and recognizing and celebrating our differences and still respecting each other. So, anyway, taking one's claim to a right on a nebulous concept that was built out of rhetoric that was pragmatic at a time and that is no longer necessarily pragmatic and was never truly desirable beyond its pragmatism is bad, actually, because, well, not everyone is born this way. Not everyone should have to lie and say they were born this way. As an aside, since it does feel relevant, can we like, as a community, as a queer community, as an LGBT Mogai community, can we stop with the binaries being recreated? Like, holy crap. It's not even an online thing. There's people in real life spaces doing this. It's not just a totally online issue, but just stop with the TMEs, the TMAs, the AMABs, AGABs, AFABs, AHABs. Society is already obsessed with genitals. There's no space in a community of us freaks and outcasts to import that from wider society and manifest into various categorizations that just divide us into boxes rather than recognize differences and recognize that we should still have solidarity regardless. Like, you know, the messy reality of queerness is the messy reality. You can't neatly shoehorn it into a box. Like, for example, labeling all things that make a trans person transgender dysphoria, maybe. Anyway, no one is saying that trans people don't have a collection of feelings that collectively can be called gender dysphoria. No one is saying that this label can't have utility in some cases. But what is being argued is that as a medicalized concept, it is not pragmatic to say that trans people are uniquely mentally ill compared to cis people that need and receive the same healthcare that we do, but for different reasons, because it's totally different to get gender affirmation from gender affirmative procedures if you're cis, but if it's trans, then it's a big culture war. Like, come on now. That's a crock of shit. And hopefully, after watching this video, you too can smell this. Ideally, no one would smell shit, but society, am I right?